So it's my pleasure today to move on to the event proper. Hi. So you may have noticed we have one of our guests on the screen here. This is not just an awkward hovering head over our shoulders. This is one of our guests. I'll get there in just a second. So we're here for Mark Cymrot and Ann Hagedorn to discuss their new books, their newest books. For Mark, The Case of the Welched Reward, and for Ann Hagedorn, Sleeper Agent, which is the true story of the spy in the nuclear program that got away. So a Soviet spy that managed to steal stuff and escape. So it's an amazing book, and I had a great honor of reading it earlier. So real quickly, I'm just going to introduce Mark and Ann. Mark A. Cymrot is the leader of BakerHostetler's LLP's International Arbitration and Litigation practice. I don't know what that means, just Mark. We should probably talk afterwards. I've read that a few times, I realized. I'm like, I don't know what a lot of that means. And co-leader of the International Asset Tracing and Recovery practice, still don't know. He is the author of more than 30 publications and a frequent speaker on topics drawn from his career in high-stakes U.S. lawsuits and international arbitration. Two of his cases were recently discussed in articles in The New Yorker. His first book, and a great book, Squeezing Silver, is the story of his role as a young lead counsel in Minpeco SA versus Nelson Bunker Hunt, which was tried in the New York federal court in 1988. And again, his brand new book is The Case of the Welched Reward, and we will have books for sale following this event. Ann Hagedorn is a former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and an award-winning author of 6 narrative nonfiction books that embrace a broad range of topics and have been highly acclaimed in reviews nationwide. She's a graduate of Denison University and holds master's degrees from the University of Michigan and Columbia University, plus an honorary doctorate from Denison. She has taught writing as an adjunct professor at Columbia University, Northwestern, Xavier, and Miami University. Her books include Beyond the River, The Untold Story of Heroes of the Underground Railroad, soon to be on film series, and Savage Peace, Hope and Fear in America, 1999. Ann was not able to make it down to DC for this, but we really, really thank her for working with us to find a way to still include her in the event, and we managed to do so. So we're really happy that she's still able to join us today. So Mark, I guess I'm going to call you up now to take over the show. Everyone, Mark.
So my biggest challenge tonight is that I just had cataract surgery and my glasses don't work, but whatever. So let me tell you how this all came together. I mean, it's kind of two odd resumes here that how do they fit? So in 1988, Ann was a Wall Street Journal reporter, and I had a big case in New York. It was Minpeco versus Nelson Bunker Hunt. It was the silver manipulation that almost crashed the U.S. economy, and it was the first too big to fail bailout by Paul Volcker of the Fed. Very controversial. Anyway, Ed, it was the Wall Street Journal reporter, and we got to know each other. And following that, I had $40 billion in lawsuits for Peru, the main ones in New York, and she was a Wall Street Journal reporter. And so we got to know each other. And you'll hear she gives me a little credit for giving her lessons in how to go about an investigation. And she helped me, once I started writing books, which was 30 years later, in story structure, how to do story structure. So we thought, and then we both wrote spy stories. Our latest books are spy stories, which just by coincidence just happened. So we said, well, let's do something together. So, and then I remember around the mid-1990s, had a coffee with Ann after going to court, and we're walking through the Lower East Side, and I have this, I still
can you get a little closer to the microphone?
Yep. I still have this image of, it was a very bright day, I didn't have sunglasses, we're walking through a park, and she says, you know, I'm going to leave the Wall Street Journal, and I'm going to become an author. And I was very supportive. I said, but how are you going to make a living? Well, she's done a good job of making a living. She now has 6 award-winning books. Beyond the River was her first, It was a dynamic network of agents of the Underground Railroad in the war before the war along the Ohio River. So she's from Ohio, and this was sort of a hometown story, and she wrote it, and it is very insightful about how you got to the Civil War and the war that occurred along the border of the Ohio River with the Underground Railroad before the war. I thought it was a fascinating book. Wild Ride is the rise and fall of the Calumet Farms, which is horse racing, big horse racing story. Savage Peace, Hope and Fear in America in 1990, which was the fallout from World War I. And now Sleeper Agent, which is was a finalist for the Edgar Awards, Best Fact Crime. And that the Edgar Awards, for those who don't know, are the Oscars or the Emmys of publishing. So she's at the top of the profession. And I appreciated the help that she gave me. So we're going to discuss our two books today. We're going to focus on how to develop the facts, how to investigate, how important that is. And then we're going to talk some about story structure. Ann planned to be here, but her husband had a medical setback. She couldn't come. Kind enough to get on Zoom. Afterwards, she sent us some signed books, and the proceeds will be available for the Writer's Center. I can sign some books also in the back. Proceeds will be available for the Writer's Center. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ann.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm honored to be here, even though I'm not really there, but I'm honored that Zach and Mark could figure out a way that I could have a presence, so thank you both. I've been a big fan of the Writers Center for many years, and a fan of Mark's for even longer. But we are only 25, so.
Don't count the years between 1988 and now.
Yeah, don't do that. Yeah, okay. So, and look at this. I mean, books truly have the power of bringing people together. Whether you're writing them, researching, reading, or promoting, the Writers Center is a perfect example. And of course, it's because of curiosity and a constant need to learn. And what I always tell young writers, as the saying goes, without stories, we're just eating machines with shoes. So learning how to tell stories is crucial to many issues. Anyhow, before diving into my latest story, Sleeper Agent, I have a few quick comments in conjunction with what Mark just said about meeting him when I was covering the trials at the Wall Street Journal. And actually, I almost wrote an article about this at one point, but then Mark wrote a book, Squeezing Silver, about the trial. And for me as a reporter, it was quite a showcase for two important tools in investigative reporting, tools that were immensely helpful in piecing together the life of a spy, especially one who was never caught. Because you realize the fact that he was never caught, J. Edgar Hoover didn't even realize he existed until, I think it was July 1954, and he was already, the spy was already back in the Soviet Union. But in this case, there were no trial transcripts to search for details, to confirm, and to use, for the drama of the narrative, or even for parts of the background. So what do? Well, for one thing, I applied two of those tools that I learned from sitting and watching Mark in action and following daily that really fascinating trial. And those two were the use of timelines for all main players and events in a story. And the crucial application of the fact that rarely, if ever, and especially in the life of a spy, are there any coincidences. And if there appear to be coincidences, then you have got to investigate them to the core. So I could spend a lot of time here tonight talking about a trial, but guess what? He has a book out on it, and so onward to spies. And my latest book, Sleeper Agent, which is, and this is sort of the elevator pitch, it's the biography of the only Soviet military-trained spy to have full security clearance in the Manhattan Project, America's top secret project to build the first atomic bomb. So his name was George Koval, and he was a U.S. Army corporal, born and raised in Iowa. He charmed everyone he met, and as sleeper agents are trained to do, he blended into the American culture. He was here from 1940 to 1948. He loved baseball, was a Yankees fan. He could reel off the history and stats of every big league pitcher. He was even a skilled shortstop. He played bridge. He belonged to 2 bowling leagues. He could recite verses from Whitman and Longfellow, and by several accounts I discovered in FBI files, he was quite a ladies' man. All the while, he was sending atomic secrets to Moscow to help build their own atomic bomb. And as the subtitle of the book tells you, he was, like I said, never caught. So it's quite a story, and it was quite a challenge. But it was also quite an adventure. I got the first hint of the story in 2016 when I was interviewing a gentleman for another book topic. But this was one of those topics that is intellectually important. It was in danger of falling through the cracks, but it lacked compelling narrative. I could not find, I kept hitting walls every time I tried to find the dramatic story that could bring alive for the general reader the issues, that were represented in the topic. So it was very encyclopedic, and I think, my quest as a writer is always to find that engaging narrative as a nonfiction writer. That will bring alive for the general reader. I'm the conduit, between mounds and mounds of documents and research and the general reader. So, so that particular topic was, like I said, not working, and I think that the man I was interviewing clearly sensed my frustration. So when I thanked him for spending time with me, he suddenly said, "Hey, do you know about the spy, the Soviet spy who lived in Dayton, Ohio, and worked for the Manhattan Project? He was Soviet trained," and he goes into this whole thing, and he knew I had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, and I said, "No, I really don't." So that was the beginning, a little hint. And for a week or so after the interview, I kept with the other topic, but of course I was fascinated by this. And so I took time off to explore what the gentleman had told me. I really believed it was a rumor. In our business, people tell you things that aren't always true, and you really have to prove that it is true before you proceed. So I made a few calls, and that wonderful mix of skepticism and curiosity sort of pushed me forward. And of course I checked the internet. I tell students and young writers, go to archives, do library research, go to old clips, et cetera, don't depend on the internet. But the first thing I did was go to the internet just to see if I could find the guy's name, before I proceeded to that next stage. So I found a New York Times article from 2007 that reported on this gentleman named George Koval, who had worked in the Manhattan Project and had been at sites in Oak Ridge and Dayton. And he had just won an award from Vladimir Putin. And it was a posthumous award for what he did to speed up the development of the Soviets' first atom bomb. So, but I still was a little skeptical, you know, nothing against the New York Times, but I just wanted to be absolutely sure that the person they were talking about was the person I was seeking, so the information I was seeking. So I made my usual lists, which is what seemed to be known about the spy named Koval, what was clearly unknown, and what would have to be confirmed if I were to go forward, and also where there might be helpful archives, much needed primary sources, and people to interview, of course. Then came what I call the flight plan. I always have a flight plan. So it's a schedule for the initial research. And thanks to Mark, I connected with a really good lawyer at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press because I wanted to gain wisdom about the latest ways to use, to best use the Freedom of Information Act to acquire FBI reports, because I knew I'd have to do a lot of digging in those files. So that was very important, as was visiting the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, plus some invaluable interviews in the DC area. I would say that my first trip to DC for the research for that book was a major turning point. And so once I was confident that I had identified the spy, from then on I was really, I have to say, largely thanks to an archivist at the National Archives, I was on it. And I barely, as everyone in my life knows, I barely took a day off from the process of finding letters, journals, postcards, news clips, yearbooks, photos, maps, tax records, ship manifests, passports, arrest records, property records, application forms, military application forms, even inscriptions in books, and thousands upon thousands of pages of FBI reports. So when you read Sleeper Agent, be sure you read the acknowledgments, because there's some fabulous people in those acknowledgments, and the notes, because the notes kind of show what this was, you know, what it entailed. So the who and the when were doable on my challenges list. That I was very confident about that very quickly. But for it to be a true biography, the why, the what, and the how had to be fleshed out. And I knew that. I have worked with the same editor at Simon & Schuster for 4 of my books, and he's a brilliant guy, and we're a good team, and I sort of know now, of course, what is expected and needed in something like this. So, and I knew it was not so easy to find those details. You know, the why, the what, and the how of this spy's activities. So, spies don't leave breadcrumbs for biographers, I can tell you that, to follow the path of their intriguing and complicated lives. So, how I did it, the use of those tools, noted earlier. Indeed, the timelines were invaluable. The assistance of a fabulous Russian translator who's also a research librarian, and a research assistant who indexed for me about 5,000 pages of FBI reports and helped me compile about 20, I would say 20 timelines to figure out where Koval was working and lodging and when and why, who his handler was, whom he might have known in Soviet spy networks, especially in Manhattan in World War II America, the role of the Soviet consulate in New York, what he actually sent to the Soviet bomb project, and when he sent it, and when it arrived, and what happened after he returned to the Soviet Union in 1948. So a lot of the answers to those questions, as you read through the book, just remember it was really, a lot of it was done through timelines. There are numerous examples throughout the book showing the results of of those timelines, and I would say my very favorite, well, I don't really have a favorite, but one I really liked and was one of those aha moments, concerned my alma mater, Columbia University, and Koval's enrollment to take a chemistry course at Columbia in the spring of 1941, shortly after he returned to America as a Red Army trained spy. That fact was simply a line in one of the FBI files, a line without any context, just the fact that he got a B in the course. So anyhow, it's a great example of what could appear to be a detail of little significance, but with some study, mainly timelines about what was happening then in nuclear physics, it became far more important than someone taking a chemistry course at an Ivy League school because he loved science, which he did, or because he wanted to make friends at his new home in New York City. So by the time Koval's enrollment at Columbia in 1941, Columbia had become a magnet for some of the most highly regarded physicists and chemists in the world, some destined to play stellar roles in the upcoming production of America's first atomic bomb. And there was another detail that I found in the FBI reports, which was on May 5th, 1940, there was a front page article in the New York Times about what was happening at Columbia in the physics department. So it was an article Koval's handler would definitely have seen, because also I uncovered the habits of his handler, including reading the newspaper, The Daily Worker, and the New York Times every day. So, perfect example of you take a detail, dig further, establish timelines, and then the truth begins to surface. There were several crucial discoveries like that, and many aha moments, as I call them. I actually think I said aha in College Park in one of my days of going through files there. But I had quite an adventure finding the addresses of the cover shops in Manhattan, and then visiting the premises, interviewing the owners, measuring distances, like from the main cover shop, which was on West 23rd Street in Manhattan, to the Flatiron Building, where meetings had taken place with Koval's handler. It took 5 minutes, by the way. So the property records in combination with FBI reports and passport files led to identifying the handler, his habits, his many names and addresses, but what did he look like? My editor said I must physically describe the handler, of course, though I wasn't sure that I could. The passport photos were all different, and I needed to reveal details about his character, et cetera, to make the description just right. So it took about, it's a perfect example between a narrative nonfiction book and a novel. It took about 3 weeks to uncover the details necessary for a true description in one paragraph of the handler. And I'll read you that paragraph if we have time in a second. Also, there was the huge question of what exactly Koval did on a daily basis while working at Oak Ridge, the Manhattan Project site where the fuels were made, the fuels for the bomb, and then sent to Los Alamos. So those daily habits could have made a big difference in the importance of his work as a spy, right? So I found the answer in the Oak Ridge archives. He was trained as a health physicist who had access to all facilities, think about that, daily. I could go into great details about this, but you gotta read the book, and you'll be fascinated by what this spy was doing as a health physicist. In short, in one of the training manuals, it said the 3 steps for daily work of the health physicist was to know all operations, be alert to changes, make thorough surveys daily. Yeah, think about that. a spy. It was a job providing excellent access. So the research was quite an adventure, and as the research deepened, so did the underlying themes of the story. I wanted to take the reader beyond the who, what, where, and how of a spy's life and place a keen eye on the why, what truly motivated him. And we need to understand what motivates, the layers of motivation for a spy. And so that brings us to the underlying themes of the book. There are several, like all spy stories, Sleeper Agent will give you the expected intrigue, the code names, the various cover shops in Manhattan, the apartments in the Bronx, the handlers, suspicious routines, stuff like that. But the book goes beyond that as it delves into the psychology of George Koval, the psychology of the spy, showing the hopes, fears, and beliefs that influenced his decisions and instigated his accomplishments, thus sort of deepening the themes and significance of a spy story, and immersing the reader into the historical context. In this case, it exposed the backlash of bigotry, the persistence of prejudice in history, and the human cost of oppression. Because Koval, though his self-designed tapestry of lies and half-truths depicts a true traitor of his country of origin, Koval was a dedicated scientist, and he was a survivor of anti-Semitism, a plague of anti-Semitism in both Russia and America. And so the book, you will read about how through his life he faced that. So he was someone who indeed knew the human costs of oppression. Also, the narrative transcends the debates about the scale of Soviet espionage in World War II America because it turns the reader's attention to the scapegoating, the opportunism, and bigotry that blurred the vision of what was truly happening regarding Soviet spy networks in the United States. Hoover knew there were such networks, but he was often hunting in the wrong territory. For example, he thought all members of the Communist Party USA had to be spies. But look at Koval. He played bridge, belonged to bowling leagues. He did not belong to the Communist Party USA. He never mingled with fellow spies, and mostly with his scientist peers. He even belonged to an electrical engineering honorary fraternity. He simply blended in. So now, if I could go on and on, of course, that's the way authors are, but I wanted to, do I have time, Zach, to read two favorite paragraphs?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So one of my wonderful editors at the Wall Street Journal used to tell us, never fall in love with your own writing. And so I agree with him. You have to remain humble or you won't, proceed into excellence or whatever, but every once in a while you kind of like what you write. So for one thing, I wanted, since I mentioned it, I want to read you my favorite paragraph, and I think because it relates to the kind of human constants, and then I'll read you that paragraph where I described the handler, the one that took weeks to research. Okay, so the first paragraph of the prologue. Sometimes the clues that should have been warnings are lost in a blur, only to be seen in hindsight. Caught in the need to move ahead, most people rush like speeding trains past the truths and half-truths tucked into the terrain they thought they knew. And so it would be for a man and a woman one evening in 1948 at New York City's Grand Central Palace, each soon to learn the timeless cost of missing clues. That's the beginning of the prologue. Then in the prologue, we learn a few details about Koval and his life in New York and one of his girlfriends. Most people, he told most people that he had grown up in an orphanage in Cleveland. He never mentioned anything else about his family. But anyhow, on October 8th, 1948, or October 6th, 1948, He boarded the SS America at Pier 61 in Manhattan and went back to the Soviet Union. So this last paragraph of the prologue is my other favorite paragraph, because you have to realize he had many girlfriends, and just remember that, and everyone thought he grew up in the orphanage in Cleveland. Though documents and interviews would someday expose parts of the truth about Koval's escape from America, some questions would never be answered, like what he was thinking as he watched the New York skyline diminish and the ocean's vast expanse draw near. Was he remembering the last time he had left America in May 1932 with his parents and his two brothers on a ship leaving from Pier 54 in Manhattan, bound eventually for the Soviet Union? Or the details of his father's stories about being a Russian immigrant and seeing America for the first time in 1910. Did he have the manner of a professional, lacking last-minute hesitations or sentimentality as the ship passed by the great statue symbolizing the freedoms of the country that was his birthplace? And did he struggle to push back all thoughts of what and whom he was leaving behind? By November, Koval would be living in the Soviet Union in Moscow with his wife of 12 years, and he would soon reunite with his father, Abram, and his mother, Ethel, and Isaiah, one of his two brothers. What he told them about his past 8 years in America on a business trip for Soviet military intelligence is unknown. But one certain fact is that George Koval left the U.S. just in time, and as anyone who knew him would likely say, his timing was always nearly perfect. So that's the beginning. And so Zach, do I have time just to read that description of the handler and then move on, or should I leave this for afterwards?
Sure, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is what, after my editor said, you have to tell your readers what the handler looked like. So anyhow, reading lots of FBI reports, and then finding, actually his senior, he was a graduate of Ohio Northern University. So I found his senior picture, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. With his rimless glasses and expressionless face, Lassen, a man of medium height, about 5'7", seemed quite ordinary. His thin brown hair showed specks of gray at an early age, and by the time Koval met him, the graying around the temples was a solid feature, as was the diamond stick pin he always wore on his tie or lapel. What made him blend into a gathering of strangers and yet stand out among acquaintances was the fact that he rarely smiled. By most accounts, he exuded an aura of skepticism and caution. A former colleague would describe Lassen as, quote, unquote, very private and discreet. He was a man with whom few wanted to spend time due to some unknown fear of him. Maybe it was just his silence. He looked hard at people, said so little. Anyhow, so that's all. So read my book and invest in Post-its. I plan to dedicate the book to the inventor of Post-its, but very, very, very useful. Color-coded. Anyway, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. So before I start about my book, I want to remind people about Zach's book, First Cosmic Velocity. It is really an amazing story, an amazing book. I couldn't put it down. Ann's book is amazing also. I want to add that. But you're looking at the Writer's Center. I couldn't have written my book without the workshops. I mean, the workshops were tremendously helpful. And here we have Zach, who is one of our leaders with his book that is quite good also. So, let me see. Where are we? So I have two things I want to talk about. First of all, facts, I always say, win cases. Facts win arguments, facts win presentations, and facts make it interesting to read a book. And so you really have to look at investigating and presenting facts in order to make an interesting book. And to show the difference, the case of the Welched Reward, I took over in the middle of the case. So you have one set of facts presented by the prior lawyers who lost horribly, and then you have another set of facts, and I want to go through the difference and why they're different and what the result will be. And then I want to talk a little about story structure, which Ann really helped me with, particularly on squeezing silver. But so what is the book about? It's a different spy. It's not the United States, it's Peru. And a fellow by the name of Vladimiro Montesinos was the head of the security services in Peru for almost a decade. And for at least the last 5 years of that decade, which was the 1990s, during the 10 years, Alberto Fujimori was the president, and particularly in the last 5 years, Montesinos controlled the country basically by bribing people, intimidating people, extrajudicial killings, and the like. And he escapes right before he's about to be arrested. So he escapes on a sailboat. How about that? Escapes on a sailboat, disappears. Disappears for 6 months in Peru, issues a reward for his capture, $5 million reward, which for Peru was an awful lot of money. And 3 more months, and then a Venezuelan spy gets caught in an FBI sting in Miami. All right, and he makes a call to Caracas, and the next day, Montesinos is arrested and quickly returned to Peru. So then the Venezuelan spy, Jose Guevara, files a lawsuit in Miami because Peru denies him the $5 million reward and actually has some support from some of the FBI agents. So it's pretty bad story as he presents it, in his complaint. So he presents it as, he's the hero. Okay, he was extorting a banker to get out Montesinos $32 million in a Miami bank to pay more bribes, but beyond that, then he cooperated, right? He told the FBI where Montesinos was, and he made the call, and Montesinos was arrested as a result of that. So what happens? So the prior lawyers, they file a motion to dismiss right at the beginning of the case. You say, look, there's no case here because of an obscure doctrine called sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity says you can't sue governments except in limited circumstances. That's true in the United States, it's true abroad. And the trial judge dismisses the case, but the Court of Appeals shows up at argument, and the lawyers for Peru don't show up. What do you mean they don't show up? Well, they say they weren't getting paid. Well, that doesn't happen to be an excuse for not showing up at a Court of Appeals argument. As a matter of fact, I have a client right now who hasn't paid me in about 3 years, and I keep asking the judge to let me out of the case, and the judge keeps saying, no, I have to keep going. So these guys had no excuse. But the court was furious. The court had the most scathing opinion that I've ever read. I get a call after this opinion comes out from a fellow I know who actually was the vice minister during the Silver case. And he's just taken the job as a first advisor to the Minister of Interior. That's the minister is the one who's responsible for the lawsuit. And they're in a panic because they can't lose this case. They can't lose and pay an associate of Vladimir Montesinos $5 million. Politically, it's dead. But I go and I read the opinion. So the court says that Peru was making false arguments. That's unheard of, a call saying that somebody's making false arguments. And then they have this line that just hung over the case for the rest of the case. Anything that makes it easier for countries to welsh on their promises. Excuse people from Wales, by the way. It was not my insult, it was theirs. So for countries to welsh on their promises to pay for information decreases the value of any reward they offer and makes it less likely that an offer will be accepted. I've never read language like that in an opinion. But I had no choice. I had to go forward. So the question was, how could I win a lawsuit that was a ticking political time bomb in Lima when it already had been hopelessly lost? Nothing was as it seemed once I started investigating. The twisted tale included much intrigue, millions of dollars, bribes, extortion, and talk of two murder plots. Murder plots in a civil lawsuit. Now that was a new one to me, but I had to go forward. So you look at the chronology presented by the prior lawyers, and you look at the facts of what they said, and then we have to go forward. So they said Guevara was caught extorting a banker. Okay, that's fine. But he cooperated. He made a call to Caracas that resulted in Montesinos' arrest. Peru denied him the reward, and they gave no reason. So here's the court pleading for information, in a sense. The Court of Appeals chided Peru, writing, for reasons that it has not disclosed in this case, Peru has refused to pay him the promised reward. Peru found that the court found that Peru had denied the reward improperly, welched, and that the sovereign immunity doctrine didn't apply, which was the best defense to this kind of thing. So the case is effectively lost. It goes back to the trial judge to now supposedly try the case. And the trial judge is a woman that I happen to know because I had done work for Peru and on extraditions, and she had been the executive U.S. attorney working on the case. We worked together. I said, oh, great, she's in law enforcement. She's going to know that rewards have to have sovereign immunity, and she's going to know that I'm a nice guy, and whatever. Well, you know, I hadn't quite calculated the impact of this Court of Appeals opinion, which really was an insult to her as well as to insult to Peru. But I had to start investigating. I started getting into the facts. I take Guevara's deposition. And so is this a fellow who was cooperative with the FBI and worried about law and order and all the rest? So I asked him the following questions. Did you understand when you were there that you were violating the laws of Peru? Oh, he makes a trip to Peru. He meets Montesinos' daughter in a church and supposedly gives her some information about how to get in touch with her father, and supposedly nothing else happened. But, you know, first I want to test, is he repentant for what happened? Did you understand when you were there that you were violating the laws of Peru by harboring a fugitive, I asked. I had no knowledge of that specific, Guevara responded. You knew at the time you were in Lima that Peru was pursuing Mr. Montesinos, correct? Yes. And you knew that you were helping Montesinos stay free of Peruvian custody, yes. I was providing a service of protection and security. In order to keep Montesinos out of jail in Peru, correct? Well, that's your opinion. And what's your opinion? I don't have an opinion. I was rendering a service. So, all right. So we've tarnished him a little because, you know, he's not repentant about violating the laws, you know, which is probably no surprise. But then we keep digging. And what do we discover? Well, we discover with the help of Peruvian prosecutors who weren't talking to us at the beginning of the case, but one of them happened to be. You know, it paid off to have 17 years working in Peru. The prosecutor was a friend of mine. So he talked to the office, and they gave us a statement that Guevara had made to Peruvian prosecutors where he admitted that Silvana Montesinos had given him $43 million in CDs, something he denied. So now he's not only a liar, but maybe he made a lot of money out of this, all right? So then we get into murder. So step by step, this is getting to be a worse story. So where is Otanel Guevara? Otanel Guevara was Jose Guevara's cousin. He was a higher level officer in the Venezuelan spy system, and he had brought Montesinos to Jose and said, please keep an eye on Montesinos and help him out. So I said, where is Otanel Guevara today? In Venezuela. What? Working for DSIP? DSIP is the spy service. No, he's in jail by DSIP. I see. Why is he in jail? He is, together with his brother Rolando and my other cousin Juan Batista, they were accused, tried, and condemned to prison for the alleged participation for the attack that killed Assistant State Attorney of Venezuela, Danilo Anderson. Oh my goodness. Well, that took my breath away because I didn't know anything about Danilo Anderson. We now have a murder that's worked its way into the case. And I did a little more digging, or we did a little more digging, and discovered that actually the Venezuelans blame Jose for financing it and the FBI for sponsoring it. And of course, how much of that was political and how much of that was true, who knows? But there is now the taint of a potential murder here. Maybe Guevara is a murderer. Well, it gets even worse. Okay? So I read a newspaper article that said that the fellow who was called in Venezuela, a fellow by the name of Nunez, says that he was signaled to murder Montesinos, not to deliver him to the police.
Wow.
So I asked Guevara, and I had to be careful here because, you know, a newspaper article is not admissible in evidence. So I don't want to just give him the opportunity to deny it, but I want to establish what was said, all right? So what did Mr. Nunez said when you told him the surprising news that you had been arrested? He asked how I was feeling, if he was to tell my wife what had happened. And what did you say? Not to tell her, nothing yet, that I was going to call her and talk to her. What's her name? Hilda. Okay, so he admits what the conversation was. I hire a Venezuelan law firm, and after a while, they come up with 2 affidavits from Mr. Nunez, who said, don't tell Nunez was a signal to kill Montesinos. All right, so now we have a guy in FBI custody whose family is involved in all these, in a very serious murder of a prosecutor. And he perhaps, while in FBI custody, and the FBI is on the line, has given an order to murder Montesinos. Well, that's a little different story than the one the Court of Appeals had heard the first time.
Wow.
Then, thank you, Ann. Then I asked the FBI, well, the first thing, the next thing that happened is that the government wouldn't allow us to examine the FBI agents, but then it turned out that one of the FBI agents had put in an affidavit in support of Guevara's case, and the government admits that it was unauthorized. So now we have a rogue FBI agent in support of a guy who may have ordered a hit while in FBI custody and the FBI is on the phone. All right? So the next step to the story is when I asked him directly, did you ever find out how Montesinos was arrested in Venezuela? And he says, from what I read in the papers, he answered. So that's all you know about what you read in the papers? Yes, unless you want me to tell you things that I can't confirm. So how's he going to prove that he directly enabled the arrest of Vladimir Montesinos? Well, he's counting on this FBI affidavit. And that was kind of strange because the FBI affidavit from a very high-level FBI agent, supervisory special agent, for Latin America at the time, had said that Guevara's call indirectly resulted in Montesinos' arrest. But the reward offer said it had to directly. So to me, that was the end of the case, but the judge didn't see it that way. She had been ordered basically in an angry opinion from the Court of Appeals to rule for Guevara. So she ends up ordering summary judgment against us. So we're losing in the trial court. But there were a couple other things that added to the story, the last couple things. So I started looking at, well, U.S. rewards. The U.S. just pay out rewards when guy indirectly rather than directly, and no, actually the IRS, there were IRS statistics, they only grant 20% of the reward applications. And they are sticklers for exactly whatever the reward has to be, you have to meet all of the requirements. And that's in US law also. So now we have a guy with an FBI affidavit that says indirectly and the reward says directly. It doesn't seem like he did. Now there's one other thing that changed the facts, which was, well, what's the implication of saying that you can sue a government over a law enforcement reward? Well, that means U.S. government and U.S. law enforcement officials could be sued abroad over the same thing. Well, nobody had suggested that to the Court of Appeals at the time, and now you're exposing the United States to 80% lawsuits of IRS and all these other lawsuits abroad. So we put that all in front of the new facts in front of the Court of Appeals after we lost horribly at the trial court, and they reversed themselves. All right? They said, well, maybe sovereign immunity, yeah, well, maybe it does. But you could just see the first set of facts that the court looked at was, here's a guy, okay, he committed a crime, but he cooperated, he did what he was supposed to do, Peru denies a reward, doesn't say why, and turns out another part of the facts that if I had more time I could read you, there's some entertaining part. There was a reasonable administrative process in Peru. It wasn't just they said no, they went through the process, they asked the FBI twice, and the resume of the various ministers at this particular time were actually quite impressive. They're not the kind of people who would just welch on a reward. So all of that meant the facts changed the result. Now, let me go to the story structure, all right? In the Silver case, what you're looking for in the story structure, as Ann said, I will put it differently, but where's the tension? Where's the conflict? Where's the human interaction here that's going to make the story interesting. And in the Hunt case, you had billionaires against the poverty of Peru, and I tried to emphasize that. And then you had a young lawyer, well, talking about poverty, you have the Hunts and the other conspirators, a number of them own thoroughbred horses. They go around to fancy hotels, they buy horses, and you know, that's what they would do. And on the other hand, in Peru, there was no toilet paper. We'd go to the office, the workers would bring their own and keep it in their desk, which they would quickly offer to American visitors as we headed towards the public restroom. Breakfast at a five-star hotel and a helicopter ride was unthinkable for Ismael Fonseca, who was the guy who was involved in the trading, and his co-workers. Public toilet paper, now that was a real luxury. So I tried to build the contrast. Then there's the contrast between the young lawyer and who I was against. They were the adults. I was a youngster trying to act like an adult. Can I stand up with the renowned lawyers who have lined up for the defense, or will I fade and be forgotten? One more pretender unfulfilled. So those were the two contrasts that I tried to keep, and they were themes throughout the case. But Ann takes a look at the draft. She says, you really ought to focus, instead of the first scene is Bunker Hunt walking into the courtroom, sitting down to be cross-examined. She said, you really ought to focus on Ismael Fonseca. Fonseca was the guy from Minpeco who had been involved in the trading. He had taken advice from Merrill Lynch and E.F. Hutton and gone into the market, something that, into the futures market, something Peru, Minpeco had never done. And his life was ruined thereafter. As a matter of fact, I didn't know at the time, and this was one of the problems with why I didn't take her advice, and probably would now, but he was involved in 2 months of a story that went on for 6 or 7 years, and I couldn't figure out how to get enough of him because he was a hostile witness. And this is an issue with nonfiction. Well, I couldn't just make up where he came from and what happened to him afterwards, and I had to sort of weave it together, and I didn't know because he was hostile. He wouldn't talk to us. He had been fired. He had lost his job. He had been criminally investigated, although not prosecuted. And so I couldn't get the facts, was my concern. And when the book came out, somebody invited me to give a speech, and his sisters are there. He had already passed away because the book came out 30 years after the trial. They said, you know, they were so thankful because he really, his life was shattered, and he couldn't get over it. And here was somebody writing a book that say, well, it wasn't his fault. It was these billionaires who were misleading him that got him into that. It was kind of a nice moment for me. Anyway, but that's the point. I mean, she saw a way of bringing it, not just the wealthy against a poor country, not just that the National Bank ran out of money to pay margins and that's why they defaulted. She saw a personal story there that I didn't quite see. Now, he is in the book. He comes up in a couple places, but not the theme where it might have taken the theme, sort of deeper into a personal story. So that was a lesson. Now, there was another kind of problem with, yes, there was a lesson. Now, there was another problem with the Welsh, the case of the Welched Reward. And you had two chronologies. You had what happened in when he escaped in 2000, 2001, and he's caught. And then you have the chronology of the lawsuit in 2008 to 2010. And how do they go together? Well, the first reaction, my first reaction is, well, you do things chronologically. Well, that would have been really boring. I mean, the first part would have been interesting. You know, he escapes on a sailboat and he ends up in the Galapagos, and then he ends up in Costa Rica, and he takes a plane faking a heart attack into Caracas. You know, oh, that's all in there, and that would have been interesting. But then you'd start talking about a lawsuit. Well, that might have got you about halfway through a book. It wouldn't have been interesting. So what I figured out is to mesh the two chronologies and tell the story of the escape and the arrest of Guevara and what, as it came out in the lawsuit, because you take discovery in a lawsuit, you take depositions, you do investigations, and you start presenting it. And so I meshed the two together, focusing on how the facts developed and bringing out the story. So that was the way I solved the problem there. But you really have to think about the story structure. Think about where are the conflicts. Think about where's the human nature part of it. And that's what I did, and with the help of Ann and also writer center workshops, and you know, some thoughtful editing there, and thank you to my helpers. Okay, there we are. We will take some questions, and you're required to ask questions. We're not going to. All right, and then there are some books in the back for they can be signed.
So it occurred to me when I read the book, and as you were talking about the book, and I think about the times that you went back to investigate and you reached out to people. And he does, I think, a lovely job of kind of giving you a feel of being in Peru as you're investigating. Did you at any time think to yourself, well, Guevara has fingers in places, sort of, in this part of the world. I could be physically in danger? Did it ever... did you ever feel like...
I should have thought about that.
If I know you did.
Yeah, not really. There are other stories about why when I go through immigration I am concerned from time to time. But that's for another book, maybe. No, not really that.
You didn't think about Montesino's supporters that were maybe...
I probably should have, because frankly, and there's part of the story in the book when Jose Ogas, who was the first special prosecutor, gets appointed by the president to be the special prosecutor, and the president immediately calls the police service and said, give them special protection.
Yeah,
and he didn't even think about that until then. And so, I don't know, perhaps the naive, well, you know, to tell you how naive I am, I was going to Peru in the 80s and the early 90s when there was terrorism, and you know, things would blow up down the street. And I went to lunch or dinner at one of the prime minister's homes, and he has this weird sculpture. And he said, oh, that was a bicycle that blew up and came over the wall, and we turned it into a sculpture. So I don't know what I was doing there without protection, but I went, and unfortunately, I didn't learn enough Spanish. That's another story. Anyway, next question. Somebody want to ask Ann something? Yes?
So when I was reading your book, and one of the things that I kept on saying to myself is like, how come they never caught the guy? You know, like it's the signs were there, but always, hindsight is 20/20, I guess. But when you were investigating, was there anybody here in the States, accused or responsible for not catching this guy, or was there anything?
Were there co-conspirators, for instance, who he left behind and were caught?
Very, very excellent question, and actually, I really tried to find out. I mean, it's really too bad I couldn't interview him. Let me just say that. Boy, I would have had some great questions. But so basically, Janine, your question is, were there, when he left, did he leave behind co-conspirators? And did Hoover find them? Is that your question?
Or was there anybody at the FBI, demoted because they didn't catch him in time, or anything like that happened? Or? There
were many barriers to getting to the truth of what happened with him, and partly because of what he was responsible for sending to the Soviet bomb, which was mainly polonium, the recipe for polonium, because that's the element that was the fuel for the initiator, the trigger of the atom bomb. And the details about polonium were top secret within a top secret organization. So it took lots and lots of digging to find out exactly what Koval had done, and so a lot of that were in documents in the Atomic Energy Commission, some even in the RAND, an individual who'd worked for the RAND Corporation. I mean, it was very hard to figure out exactly what he had done and why he was not caught. And so, and why it was so, and why it was not revealed for so long. I mean, he was basically, until 2007, when Putin gave him that award, posthumous award, he had been undetected. I mean, really undetected in terms of telling his story and digging everything up. And how is that possible? Well, part of it was because of what he did, and part of it was because Hoover did not catch him until, didn't find out about him until July of 1954, and he tried over and over to get him extradited. Because Hoover knew, Hoover's people knew what he had done. So it was, that case was kept open really until, I think, 1978 is when it shut down. It's in the books, 1978 or 1980. I mean, they kept it open because they were still trying to nail him. They wanted to bring him back to this country so they could, charge him with treason. But they couldn't get him back. And so really, in answer to your question, is twofold. One, the reason he was never detected was, while he was here, was that there was no reason to. There was no reason to investigate him, because he was a scientist who was very much needed in the Manhattan Project, right? And then he never, once he was discharged from the Army in February, after the war in 1946, when, you have the House Un-American Activities going, bonkers with Soviet spies, he kept a hugely low profile. He never mingled with other spies. So he was much needed during the war. He never mingled with spies. He figured out how to avoid all connections with anyone who was defecting. In the 1940s, there was a defector up in Ottawa who was part of the network. He stayed away from all of that, and he got out of the country as soon as he possibly could. And so he was well trained as a sleeper agent. He was well trained to blend in. And there was no reason to investigate him while he was doing the spying in the Manhattan Project, because he was a highly respected scientist with a very important job, and the U.S. Army was his cover. So then Hoover does find out about him, and Hoover there's a 1956 report that you find out that about the polonium and this and that, and he tries for years, and it doesn't work, and they try again, I think, was it William Webster, who was the next director of the FBI? And finally, they just stopped trying, and so then Koval's story fell through the cracks. Fell through the cracks for obvious reasons. And then in the 1990s, a very interesting thing happened. That former Rand Corporation gentleman who was a CIA agent, I'm fairly confident he was. Anyhow, he read. There was a book that came out, and this is so fascinating. There was a book that came out in the mid-1990s. That very excellent spy book, nonfiction, and in it there's a discussion about how there was a 1949 report about polonium, and that really was one of the most important details that was sent out and given to, sent out to the Kurchatov, the head of the science of the Soviet bomb. That report, 1930, was 1949 report, 139 pages, and the authors said they weren't sure who did it. They thought one particular spy did it, but they weren't sure. So this guy from Rand reads that book and knows exactly who did it. It was George Koval. And so, so these things start to, unfold even in the 1990s. It's just so fascinating. And that guy, once he discovered that, my Russian translator then found that original report from 1949, and, with timelines, we figured out it was George Koval who wrote it. But that guy started a correspondence with George, because they had been at Oak Ridge together. And he sends him this, letter saying, "I'd really like to talk to you. I'd really like to write your biography, basically, because I know what you did." It's just fascinating. It's fascinating how he remained undercover for decades and decades.
Well, you think about it.
Yeah.
You think about it. The Rosenbergs were caught and executed. It was a huge public scandal, and yet he probably did a lot more damage than they did. And I suspect there was some political reasons why people didn't want to tell his story, and he got away.
Yeah, and one of the Miracle brothers, the sons, Robert and Michael Miracle, I think, one of the sons wrote an op-ed to the New York Times after that story of Putin giving the posthumous award, and saying, making that point. Look, my parents did, first of all, Ethel, did nothing. And there was in the Venona codes, we could go into this for hours, but there was, well, anyhow, we don't need to go into all that, but one of the Miracle brothers wrote a fabulous op-ed saying that this is tragic from the point of view of the Rosenberg story, because they, you know, his father, whatever it was they were accused of, which is in sleeper agent, the details that they were accused of, it doesn't come close to this.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
And that was my comment about, you know, the underlying themes of sleeper agent. It's not just getting into the psychology of the spy. It's not just getting into the, you know, excitement of the spy saga, but it's also showing how all of the scapegoating that went on in the 1950s covered, I mean, you know, Hoover was right. There were Soviet networks of spies. He was absolutely right. But he exposed the wrong people, you know. He was hunting in the wrong field. And so, you know, the anti-Semitism and all of the bigotry and the scapegoating that went on in that time blurred the truth. And so somebody like George gets away with it.
Yep.
And it isn't until 2007 that the world knows. And then, you know, then he falls through the cracks again in a way, because it's sort of, what did he really do? So that was something that really motivated me. I wanted to find out. And really, after the research for this and the writing of it, I really kind of wanted to go back to school and get a degree in nuclear physics.
That might be a little more difficult.
Oh, no, but it's so fascinating. Anyhow. So
How are you going to make a living doing that? How are you going to make a living doing that?
Yeah, right. Yeah, we're right. Getting a PhD in nuclear physics. I don't think so.
Yeah. Anyway, more questions? Yes.
Yes. So thank you so much. First of all, congratulations to both of you. I'm really looking forward to reading your books. I'm curious about the process of writing the book. It seems that this research for both of you took many years, right? So how do you get like the motivations to? You mentioned, Anne, that you have those aha moments throughout the process. And I can imagine that at some points, perhaps you may find yourself stuck in your research, that perhaps you are not finding the answers that you need for your research. So, I don't know, in a process of so many years of researching for a book, I have many questions that come to my mind. For example, do you start writing chapters before you have completed all the research that you need? You have 6 books, for example. Do you write or research for several books at the same time, or you wait until you finish a book to start writing the following book? I don't know, I'm just very curious, because to me it's fascinating, you know, what you guys do, and I don't know how, like, to me, I work on cases that perhaps I'm involved in 1-2 years. I can't imagine how researching something for so many years can be, and whether like the focus changes over time, or perhaps you find new elements that perhaps make you change the focus of your research, or I don't know, just curious about that. Thank you.
Go ahead. You answer that one first.
I think, yeah, so Mark, can you summarize that? So it's really
so the question,
process of it, right?
Yeah, I've got to do this for the record, yeah. So the question is basically, what's your process? Do you research and then write, or do you write along the way? I mean, what is your process? How do you get through it?
That's a very important question. And actually, somebody at University of Michigan asked me that question, and then wrote a magazine piece in the University of Michigan's magazine, Michigan Today. I think it was like 2 years ago. But I've invented something called the gather and sift method. Yeah. So in short, I am a firm believer in, just being shot out of a cannon, like I said earlier, reading this, reading that, But as I gather things, I organize them, and analyze them. Within, like, I would say 2 months of researching a topic, I start to sketch out the narrative. And then that sketch will change many times, but it's a process of gathering information and keeping track of it, basically. So you don't, and I learned that being a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, basically. You know, I mean, I saw fellow reporters, you know, on deadline with piles of notebooks and, you know, almost in a panic because, you know, they had so much great information, but they had to do a front page story, and what if you forgot X, Y, and Z? Where's X, Y, and Z and all of that, you know? And so, the key to it is to keep track of what you're uncovering. And, you know, it doesn't take that much time to do that, you know, so you either, you know, index your notebooks or you keep files. I mean, former students of mine have, you know, done things, you know, of course created online files. But the main thing is to keep track of the story that is, you know, there's a difference between a topic and a story. So you pick a topic and you got to find the story that's going to bring alive the topic, right? So then you have a sense of that from the beginning. So you sketch that at the beginning. And then as you do your reporting and your research, you analyze what you've learned and see where it fits in. And then you organize, you know, your information so that none of the great details fall through the cracks as you're doing it. So it's a combination of researching and
sketching out how you're going to use that information for your book. And so when do you write? Do you finish that process and then you write, or do you write along the way?
Oh no, I do it all together. You know, like with Ransom, my second book, while I was in a hotel in London doing interviews, all of a sudden I realized how I thought one of the chapters should start. So I just sat down in the lobby one day and wrote it. You know, I mean, the thing about writing is you can't, especially long form writing, whether it's you know, a magazine piece or a book, you cannot allow that information to keep piling up and piling up, because number one, it can cause panic later, and number two, you can lose some of the great details. So you got to keep track of it. And that is the key. And if the notion, I mean, a lot of times I'll write the beginnings of chapters while I'm in the process of research, because I run into something that I know is so compelling, because the beginnings of chapters and the ends of chapters have got to be compelling. And so you find little details that really grab you, write it down. Describe it, but file it so you remember that you did it. And you know, sketching out the story structure, it can change. It's not like an outline. It's not an outline. It is a story structure that can change as you do your reporting.
Absolutely.
But to have that from the very beginning, I mean, you can do, with Sleeper Agent, there are a couple beginnings of chapters, like when I get into the Depression, 1930s, and the anti-Semitism that kind of drives George and his family to the Soviet Union. You know, I begin the chapter with the biggest locust attack in the history of the world, I think, which happened in the Great Plains in 1931, I think it is. Anyhow, so a way to get the reader into the Depression, you know, where George and his family were living, what they experienced in Iowa because of the locust attack. So, I mean, little things like that. I wrote that, you know, right after I found it, because I thought I'm going to use this somewhere. Yeah. So so to answer your question, it's really a combination of, you know, having a sketch. I just finished a book proposal for my next book, and I included the narrative sketch in it because I had to show the publisher that this is possible to do this book. And here's my narrative sketch. That's and with the caveat that it will change as I do more research, but. If you go off into your research with a sense of what that narrative sketch is, first of all, you'll have more confidence, and second of all, it'll be a lot more fun.
So
Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Kind of the same, yeah. It's kind of the same for me. I mean, I'm writing the two I've written. The next one's different, but the two I've written are completed cases. And you say, oh, well, it's all there. Well, Minpeco had 1 million pages of documents. And so as you're going through, you're figuring out the story structure, and then something hits you, and you write, and then you go on. On the other hand, once you're into it, it's really important, and you read a lot of authors who say it's hard to start writing. And so it's important to write every day.
Yeah.
So I would write, first thing, wake up, get a cup of coffee, go to my office, and then you have to start writing.
Yeah.
And that's not so easy.
Yeah.
And so what I would do, usually I'd fiddle with the stuff that I've written before as a way of starting, and then I would write. And I'd write for like 2 or 3 hours. You can't write for more than that. And then I would do maybe research in the afternoon, because that requires a different kind of concentration. So there is the discipline of writing every day. And of course, in our work, then you get interrupted by a brief or trial or whatever, and then I can't write for a couple months, and then I gotta, oh my God, what was I thinking of? And you gotta do it again. And then, so I write, but then when you're going through it, even when you have a full manuscript, it's like, well, how does this fit together? It requires a lot of mixing and matching and rewriting. So.
Right. Well, John McPhee, do you guys know, the writer John McPhee, he said, writing teaches writing. And what is so great about that is that, he's just saying that the more you do it, also Joan Didion once, I went to a lecture by Joan Didion, and she said, practice, practice, practice. The more you do it, the more of a habit it becomes. And so you miss it if you don't do it. So then it doesn't seem like any sort of a task. And so I think in the answer to your question, so I think you might not use all that you write as you're doing your research, but you gotta keep, like Mark said, you gotta keep up the writing as you're researching.
I have a file with I call inserts, 20 or 30 inserts, where I took something in, took it out, and whatever. And some of it never gets back in.
Yeah, that's true.
Hemingway said a great thing, that he would end the day in the middle of a sentence.
Really?
So when you get up, you know where to start.
Oh, really? I'll have to try that one.
Mark, what was that?
Who was it who said that?
Hemingway.
Hemingway said he would end the day in the middle of a sentence, so when he got up the next morning, he'd know where to start.
Yeah, okay, interesting, yeah.
Steinbeck wrote he would write he would start his writing by saying write something about how hard it was to write the previous day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a similar question for either of you both me. So, how did you decide this is a book? Like, did any of your books start off as stories first, or articles, and then you decide, hey, I want to write a book about this? Like, just a little bit before the process, like how do you get to the decision point that?
It's easy for me. It's a case that was difficult that I won, but yeah. No, I'm working on the next one, and I don't know if it'll end up being a book. But Ann, how do you decide what to write about?
Yeah, right. Excellent question. Boy, I should really write a book about that. You know, I'd like to do a book that's all the book proposals I've ever written.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I only had 2 rejected. One was the epic saga of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Yeah, I really wanted to write that one.
Well, you didn't know that the house I bought was, what's his name?
Fitzsimmons.
Yeah,
Fitzsimmons.
Fitzsimmons. Oh, you know that story, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I covered the Teamsters for a while for the WSJ, and I was fascinated by them, but anyhow, that one didn't fly. But anyhow, so what was the question again? Sorry.
How do you decide what's the story?
Oh, how do you decide? Okay, well, I have criteria, and you know, one is that it has to be something fresh. It has to be doable. It has to have significance and be in danger of falling through the cracks. It has to have market appeal. You know, it's very, very, very important. And you know, just a strong sense of purpose. You know, finding something that is a great story that really grabs me, and that has not been told. And like I said, is in danger of falling through the cracks. That is doable and, you know, very dynamic and significant and relevant to, you know, kind of timelessly relevant in a way. So the criteria are, you know, pretty demanding, but there's always something out there, and you know, I always go through this phase between books where I think, okay, now I'm going to start writing novels. You know, it's just like that description of The Handler.
Interesting.
Oh boy, you know, if it were a novel, I could have described it in a half an hour, but it took me 3 weeks to find enough information to describe him. So I always get into this, so now is the time I want to start writing novels, and then you know, I always come across something and I always figure, no, narrative nonfiction is my calling, you know, and I'm the conduit between mounds of documents and things and the general reader. We have, you know, a job to do. You know, so that things, important topics don't, like I said, fall through the cracks. So one of the key things is to always know the difference between a topic and a story. You know, the story brings alive the topic. So it's sort of like the micro telling the macro, right? So anyhow, I don't know.
So
does that help?
we're in the Joram Pedagorsky room, okay? And Joram had a lab at the NIH, and then he wrote his first book, Jellyfish Have Eyes, and which is a fascinating book about his research, which was about jellyfish. But then Joram says to me, because he was on the board of the Writer Center for quite a while, he says, look, then you have to go into nonfiction because it just frees you up.
It just what?
It frees you up. It frees,
Yeah.
you know, you don't have any boundaries. It's whatever you want. And
Yeah.
so he then started writing fiction. And he has these fascinating books. The first one that he had that was what happens between death and the afterlife. And this fellow, and he has this fellow who's in between the two, and he attends his own funeral and listens to the speeches, and you know, and he goes on from there, and then frankly they get wilder and wilder. So I mean, he has been freed up by fiction, and so.
Well, I find that enviable relatable, but on the other hand, I think narrative nonfiction is so interesting because it requires two skill sets. You know, literary techniques.
Yes.
You know, the story structure is really the creative core of it, and so it requires an understanding of literary techniques, and at the same time, it requires research capabilities. You know, so it's like the two skill sets, and I find that challenge fascinating. You know,
No,
I think I would miss it.
Yeah. I've been thinking about my next book, which I started researching, and I wrote the first chapter, which I don't know if will ever get used, about a family saga. My grandfather was born in Ukraine, was in the first wave of Jews that went to what was then Palestine. First he leaves home when he's 13, I have trouble understanding that. Comes to the United States when he's 18, he ends up with 22 patents, including some of the first ones that had an impact on the development of the electric battery. So, but the research is not so easy. You know, you're going back to Ukraine, you're going back to Palestine in the 1880s, early 1900s. I'm just getting into this. But to answer your question, have I written anything? Yeah, the first chapter about him leaving home when he's 13. Yeah, I put down a few pages on that just because it motivated me.
Yeah, you have to catch the writing. It's like William Styron. I sat next to, you know, William Styron. He wrote Confessions of Nat Turner and Sophie's Choice. And I sat next to Styron at a dinner once and just asked him, you know, what advice do you have for a young writer? And so he looked at me and he said, keep a notebook with you at all times. And if something grabs you and you want to write it then. Just excuse yourself, go to the restroom, go outside, do whatever, and write it down. And that is the best advice.
You have to catch it. Sometimes
you have to catch it because it's coming out, and you think it, and it's just like. So I said, well, can you give me an example? He said, yeah, and he said, keep that notebook next on your bedstand, because he said Sophie's Choice was a dream, and when he woke up, you know, he woke up in that sort of place between really waking up and being, you know, totally conscious and being slightly awake. It's called like hypnagogic or something. Anyhow, he caught it and wrote it down. And it was basically a dream he had, and then he developed it. But it's, but you know, your subconscious mind is, you know, processing all kinds of stuff all the time. And so if you're just sitting, I remember sitting on a subway once, you know, after interviewing somebody for a story for the WSJ, and all of a sudden while I was sitting on the subway, I realized how it should start, so I started writing it right there. You know, you got to catch it when it comes to you. It's not something that you can just sort of say, okay, I mean, just like when you have a dream, and that's what William Styron was talking about. If you have a dream, don't just think you're going to remember all the details later, you know, so do it, you know.
Do you discuss your ideas in the process with someone else, or you just write everything and then you have, and then after you write, you discuss with someone?
I think usually.
So whereas you got an idea.
I think usually I write it first, and then I'll show people what the writing is, and take comments, and that's what I don't really sit and talk about it too much. No.
Yeah, right. I
You
agree.
also? Yeah.
Yeah, no. Ooh.
But on the idea of catching it, I mean, you know, this happens when I'm in court and the adrenaline just brings out stuff. I mean, I've studied a case, I've prepared, and all of a sudden I'm up and I'm arguing it, and I say something and I say, where the heck did that come from? Boy, that was smart.
That's from your file cabinet and your subconscious.
Yeah.
Your subconscious is working constantly, you know, hard working.
All right, we need to let these people go, Ann.
Yeah, so thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah,
There are books back there. Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.